There are places in the American Southwest where the sandstone has been carved by wind and water over millions of years into formations that seem impossible, where cliffs rise hundreds of feet in sheer faces of red and gold and white, where canyons cut so deep into the earth that the rivers at the bottom are in perpetual shadow, where the stone itself is layered like a book, each stratum a chapter in geological time stretching back hundreds of millions of years. And in this landscape, in the alcoves and the caves and the sheltered spaces beneath the overhangs, in the darkness behind narrow entrances that you would not notice unless you knew to look, there is evidence of human presence that goes back 12,000 years. Not a continuous presence. Not the same people in the same way for all that time, but wave after wave of human occupation people adapting to this harsh landscape, learning to extract water and food from what seems like barren rock, creating cultures and cosmologies and material expressions of extraordinary sophistication, leaving behind marks and structures and artifacts that tell stories we are still learning to read. Some of these sites are well known, have been excavated and documented and incorporated into the archaeological narrative of the Southwest, but many are not. Many are in places that are difficult to access, that require technical climbing or long approaches through country with no trails and no water, that are on land where access is restricted, either because it is managed wilderness or because it is tribal land where outsiders are not permitted, or because the sites are considered so fragile or so sacred or so vulnerable to looting that their locations are kept deliberately secret, even from the archaeological community at large. These are the forbidden caves, forbidden not in the sense that no one knows about them, but in the sense that most people cannot reach them, cannot see them, cannot verify with their own eyes what is reported to be there. The knowledge of these sites exists in controlled circles. Among archaeologists who have permits and relationships with tribes and land managers, among indigenous communities for whom the sites are part of living cultural heritage, among a small number of explorers and rock climbers who have found things that they sometimes report and sometimes do not. And what is reported, what filters into the public record through archaeological publications and through controlled media accounts and through the careful, often vague descriptions that are designed to inform without revealing exact locations, is extraordinary. Structures built in alcoves hundreds of feet above canyon floors, accessible only by routes that would challenge modern climbers. Pictograph and petroglyph panels covering cave walls with imagery that spans thousands of years, from Paleo-Indian through Archaic, through Ancestral Puebloan, through historic Navajo and Apache, each layer of imagery a window into a different time and a different way of understanding the world. Caches of artifacts, baskets and sandals and tools and ceremonial objects preserved in the dry cave environment with a completeness that is almost never found in open-air sites. Materials that are so well preserved that you can see the individual fingerprints of the person who wove the basket 3,000 years ago. And then there are the things that do not fit easily into the standard narrative, the artifacts and features that raise questions about what we think we know about the timeline of cultural development, about the extent of trade networks, about the technological capabilities of ancient peoples, about the possibility of cultural contact between groups that are supposed to have been separated by distance or time. These are the findings that generate controversy, that divide the archaeological community, that live in a liminal space between accepted knowledge and disputed interpretation. They are not proof of ancient aliens or lost civilizations, or any of the more sensational claims that populate alternative archaeology. They are simply data points that complicate the story, that suggest the human history of the Southwest is more complex, more interconnected, more surprising than the models we have built to explain it. This exploration is not an attempt to prove any particular controversial claim. It is instead an examination of what is actually in the Southwest caves, what we know about the people who used them over 12 millennia, what the evidence tells us and what it does not tell us, and why so much of this evidence is inaccessible. Why the caves are forbidden, what that restriction means for our understanding of the past and for the preservation of these irreplaceable sites. It is an exploration of deep time in a landscape that makes deep time visible. Where you can stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon and see geological layers that represent 2 billion years, where the human presence of 12,000 years is recent, is barely a mark on the surface of the stone's memory. But where that brief human presence has left traces that are profound, that are beautiful, that are mysterious in ways that 12 decades of professional archaeology have not entirely resolved. The Southwest is not one landscape. It is a collection of overlapping regions, each with its own character, its own geology, its own human history. The Colorado Plateau, a vast uplifted region covering parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, carved by the Colorado River and its tributaries into canyons and mesas and buttes, is the iconic landscape of the Southwest, the landscape of Monument Valley and the Grand Canyon and Canyon de Chelly. The Sonoran Desert, lower and hotter, stretching across southern Arizona and into Mexico, is the landscape of saguaro cacti and volcanic peaks and ancient irrigation canals. The Chihuahuan Desert, the high basin and range country of southern New Mexico and West Texas, is the landscape of vast horizons and isolated mountain ranges and underground rivers. The Rio Grande Valley and the river valleys of its tributaries, threading through New Mexico and Colorado, are the places where water creates corridors of green in the arid landscape, where agriculture was possible, where the largest pueblos and the most complex societies developed. Each of these regions has caves. Some are solution caves, carved by water through limestone, rare in this landscape, but present where the geology allows. Most are erosional features, alcoves and overhangs and sheltered spaces carved by wind and water out of the softer layers of sandstone and shale, protected by harder caprock above. These shelters range in size from small overhangs barely large enough for a person to crouch under, to vast amphitheaters hundreds of feet deep and hundreds of feet wide, chambers that could hold several modern houses. And human beings have been using these shelters for as long as human beings have been in this landscape. The earliest evidence of human presence in the Southwest dates to the Paleo-Indian period, roughly 1300 to to 80 years ago. The time immediately following the end of the last ice age, when the megafauna, the mammoths, and the giant ground sloths, and the camels and horses still roamed the landscape, and when the first humans entered the region following game exploring, establishing the patterns of movement and use that would be refined and modified over the millennia to come. The Paleo-Indian evidence in the southwest is limited. A scatter of distinctive stone points, Clovis and Folsom and other types, found on the surface or in stratified deposits, associated in some cases with the bones of extinct animals, evidence of successful hunts. Some of this evidence comes from open sites, kill sites where animals were butchered, campsites where tools were made and repaired. But some comes from caves. The evidence is fragmentary. A Clovis point found in the fill of a cave, its stratigraphic context unclear, its association with other materials uncertain. Charcoal from a hearth in a deep alcove, radiocarbon dated to 11,000 years ago, evidence that someone made a fire here at the end of the Pleistocene, but with no other artifacts to tell us who they were or what they were doing. A few caves have yielded more substantial Paleo-Indian assemblages, enough material to say with confidence that the cave was used during this period, that people sheltered here, made tools here, cooked and ate here. But the overall picture is sparse, which may reflect the reality that Paleo-Indian populations were small and mobile, that they used caves opportunistically, but did not occupy them intensively. Or it may reflect the fact that the evidence is there, but is buried under 12,000 years of subsequent deposition under the layers of later occupation. Inaccessible without extensive excavation. What is clear is that by the Archaic period, roughly 8,000 to 2,000 years ago, caves were being used extensively across the southwest. The Archaic is the long period of cultural development between the end of the Paleo-Indian big game hunting tradition and the beginning of agriculture and settled village life. It is a period characterized by increasing adaptation to local environments, by the development of specialized tools and techniques for exploiting the specific resources of specific places, by the beginning of plant cultivation and the slow transition toward agriculture. And it is a period for which caves provide some of the best and most detailed evidence. Archaic peoples used caves for shelter, for storage, for burials, for reasons that we can infer, and for reasons that remain unclear. The dry cave environment of the Southwest is extraordinary for preservation. Organic materials that would rot or decay in most environments, wood and fiber and leather, and even food remains, are preserved in the dry caves of the Southwest with minimal deterioration. Excavations in archaic cave sites have yielded baskets so well preserved that the weaving techniques are clearly visible, that the materials can be identified to the species of plant, that modern basket makers can study them and reproduce the techniques. Sandals woven from yucca fiber, cordage, nets, bags, all preserved in condition that is almost miraculous by archaeological standards. The artifacts tell us things about archaic life that we could not know from stone tools alone. They tell us that these people were skilled craftspeople, that they had developed sophisticated technologies for working with plant fibers, that they were making portable containers for gathering and storing food, that they were mobile, but that they returned to the same places, repeatedly leaving behind caches of materials to be retrieved on later visits. They tell us about diet, because some of the caves contain preserved food remains, seeds and nuts and cactus fruits, and the remains of animals, evidence of what was being eaten, what was being gathered and hunted, what the seasonal patterns of resource use were. And they tell us about cosmology, about how these people understood the world, because some of the caves contain rock art images painted or pecked onto the stone walls. Images that range from naturalistic depictions of animals and humans to abstract geometric forms to complex compositions that seem to represent visions or spiritual experiences or cosmological narratives. The interpretation of rock art is difficult and contested. But it is clear that the making of images on cave walls was not random, was not idle decoration, was something that mattered enough to these people, that they invested time and effort and materials into creating it, often in locations that are remote and difficult to access, often in contexts that suggest ritual or ceremonial significance. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos in this way. The pacing is slow, the exploration is deep, and the subject reaches back through thousands of years of human presence in one of the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth. And if you are finding this compelling, if the mystery of these ancient hidden places is drawing you in, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. It helps others find these explorations, and it lets me know that this kind of careful attention to the long arc of human history is something you want more of. Let me know in the comments where you are right now and what time it is as you listen. I am always curious about who is drawn to these stories of stone and time, and the marks that people leave behind. Now let us go deeper into the landscape itself, into the specific cave systems and the specific findings that illuminate 12,000 years of human history, into the questions that remain unanswered and the sites that remain restricted, into the forbidden caves and what they hold. The geography of the Southwest creates the conditions for both the formation of caves and for the preservation of archaeological materials within them. The layered sedimentary rocks, sandstone and limestone and shale, erode differentially. The harder layers resist erosion and form caprock, the protective roofs of overhangs and alcoves. The softer layers beneath are carved away by wind and by water, by the freezing and thawing of moisture in the rock, by the slow chemical dissolution of certain minerals, creating the sheltered spaces, the caves and alcoves that are so characteristic of the Southwest landscape. The climate is arid, which means that once materials are deposited in these sheltered spaces, they are protected from the moisture that causes decay. The relative humidity in many Southwest caves is extremely low, low enough that organic materials can last for thousands of years with minimal deterioration. This is why the Southwest has yielded some of the most complete and most informative archaeological assemblages in North America, why we can study perishable materials from cultures that flourished thousands of years ago. Why the preservation is good enough that we can see details of technology and craftsmanship and daily life that are invisible in most archaeological contexts. But the same conditions that create and preserve these sites also make them vulnerable. The caves are fragile environments. The archaeological deposits can be damaged or destroyed by flooding, by rockfall, by the presence of humans and animals. And the artifacts, once they are exposed, once they are removed from the dry, stable environment of the cave, begin to deteriorate. A basket that has survived for 3,000 years in a dry cave can begin to fall apart within weeks if it is exposed to moisture and fluctuating temperatures. This is why professional archaeologists are so careful about excavation methods, about controlling the environment around artifacts, about ensuring that what is removed from a site can be properly conserved. But it is also why looting is so destructive. A looter digging in a cave site is not concerned with preservation, is not documenting context, is not controlling the environment. The goal is to extract objects that have market value, to sell them to collectors. And in the process, the archaeological context is destroyed. The information about what was associated with what, about the stratigraphy, about the sequence of deposition, is lost forever. The artifacts that are taken may survive in private collections, may eventually surface in museums, but they are decontextualized, are objects without provenance, are beautiful or interesting or valuable, but are no longer able to tell us the full story they could have told if they had been excavated properly. This is one of the reasons why so many Southwest cave sites are forbidden, why access is restricted, why locations are kept secret. The looting of archaeological sites in the Southwest has been a problem for more than a century. It reached a peak in the mid-20th century when there was a substantial market for Southwestern artifacts, when pot hunters would systematically excavate sites, would remove anything of value, would leave the sites destroyed. Federal and state laws now provide some protection, make it illegal to excavate or remove artifacts from sites on public land without permits, make it illegal to sell artifacts taken from public land. But enforcement is difficult, the landscape is vast, the sites are often remote, and looting continues. The result is a tension between the desire to share knowledge about these extraordinary sites, to make the findings accessible to the public, to allow people to appreciate the depth and the richness of the human history of the Southwest, and the need to protect the sites, to prevent further looting, to preserve what remains for future generations, and for the indigenous communities who maintain cultural and spiritual connections to these places. Most of the detailed information about cave sites in the Southwest is published in archaeological journals and reports that are available to researchers, but that deliberately omit precise locations. The reports will describe the materials found, will provide radiocarbon dates and artifact typologies and interpretations, but will identify the site only in general terms: a cave in northern Arizona, a rock shelter in southeastern Utah, without the specificity that would allow someone to locate it. Some exceptionally important sites are not published at all in detail, are known only through brief mentions, through references in broader syntheses, through the knowledge held by the archaeologists who excavated them, and by the land managers and tribal representatives who oversee them. And then there are the sites that are completely off the record that exist in what might be called the archaeological grey literature, or in no literature at all, sites that have been found by climbers or hikers or ranchers that may have been reported to authorities or may not. That may have been investigated informally or may have been left alone, that are part of the landscape's hidden history known to a few, unknown to most. I want to describe a specific cave system, one that is documented and published, but whose exact location is kept restricted, because the findings from this site illustrate what the Southwest caves can contain and why they matter. The site is in a remote canyon in southern Utah, in a side drainage of a larger canyon system, accessible only by a difficult approach that requires several hours of hiking through terrain with no trails and no water, followed by a technical climb to reach the cave entrance. The cave is a large alcove, perhaps 100 feet deep and 50 feet wide, in a sandstone cliff face, protected by an overhang that keeps the interior dry even during rare rainstorms. The floor of the cave is covered with archaeological deposit, layers of sediment and ash and debris that represent thousands of years of intermittent occupation. The site was excavated in the 1980s by a university team working under permits from the Bureau of Land Management and in consultation with local tribes. The excavation was systematic, the deposits were carefully screened, the materials were documented and conserved. The findings were extraordinary. The deepest levels of the deposit, the oldest, contained archaic period materials dating to between 3,000 and 2,000 years ago. These levels yielded basketry, cordage, sandals, fiber bags, all in excellent condition. The baskets showed a variety of weaving techniques, some coiled, some plaited, evidence of skilled craftsmanship. There were stone tools, projectile points and scrapers and grinding stones. There were food remains, charred seeds from wild plants, bones from small mammals and birds. There was evidence of hearths, concentrations of ash and charcoal where fires had been built. The radiocarbon dates from the charcoal established the age of the occupation. The spatial distribution of the artifacts suggested that different areas of the cave were used for different activities: a cooking area near the hearths, a sleeping area with concentrations of fiber materials, a work area where tools were made and repaired. Above the archaic levels, separated by sterile sediment, indicating a period when the cave was not used, were deposits from the basket maker period, the early phase of ancestral Puebloan culture, dating to between 500 BC and 750 AD. The basket maker peoples were transitioning from hunting and gathering to agriculture, were beginning to cultivate corn and squash and beans, were beginning to live in more permanent structures. The basket maker deposits in this cave contained all of the artifact types from the archaic levels, baskets and sandals and tools. But also new types pottery, which appears in the Southwest during the basket maker period, simple gray, where vessels unfired, adobe evidence of structures, post holes and floor features, suggesting that a pit house or a storage structure had been built inside the cave. And there were burials. 3 individuals, adults and a child, buried in shallow pits in the cave floor, placed in flexed positions, wrapped in fiber blankets, accompanied by grave goods, pottery vessels and baskets and tools. The burials were treated with utmost respect by the excavators, were documented photographically, and then reburied in consultation with tribal representatives, following protocols that recognize the cultural sensitivity of human remains and the rights of descendant communities. Above the basket maker levels were Puebloan period deposits, dating from 750 AD to roughly 1300 AD, the period when ancestral Puebloan culture reached its peak, when the great pueblos and cliff dwellings were being built across the Four Corners region. The Puebloan deposits in this cave were less extensive than the earlier levels, suggesting that by this time the cave was being used less intensively, perhaps because people were living in larger pueblos in the open and were using the cave only for storage or for specialized activities. But the materials that were there were remarkable. Pottery of various types, decorated black-on-white wares, corrugated utility wares, evidence of the regional ceramic traditions. Intact corn cobs, preserved by the dry environment, showing the varieties of corn that were being grown. Textiles, woven cotton fabric, evidence that cotton cultivation and weaving had been adopted by this time. And ceremonial objects, painted wooden sticks, shell and turquoise ornaments, objects that likely had ritual significance. The uppermost levels of the deposit contained materials from the historic period, Navajo and Ute artifacts from the 18th and 19th centuries, evidence that the cave continued to be used even after the ancestral Puebloans abandoned the region, that later peoples found value in this sheltered space. The excavation of this one cave yielded information spanning more than 3,000 years of human history. It provided a stratigraphic sequence that could be used to refine the chronology of cultural development in the region. It provided organic materials that could be radiocarbon dated, establishing absolute dates for the different occupational phases. It provided artifacts that could be studied to understand technology and subsistence and social organization. And it provided a window into the lives of the people who used this place, into their daily activities, into their diets, into their burial practices, into the objects they made and valued. But this is one cave. The excavation required permits, required tribal consultation, required funding and expertise and years of work. The findings have been published in archaeological journals, but the site location is kept confidential. The artifacts are curated in a university museum where they are available for research, but are not on public display. The site itself was backfilled after excavation. The deposits that remained were covered to protect them. The entrance to the cave is not marked, is not publicized, is known only to the land managers and to the archaeologists who worked there. And there are hundreds of similar caves across the Southwest. Thousands, probably, if you count every rock shelter and alcove that shows evidence of human use. Most have not been excavated. Most have not been investigated professionally at all. Some are known to archaeologists, are recorded in site files, are monitored periodically to check for looting or deterioration. Many are not formally recorded, exist only in the knowledge of people who have found them, who may have reported them or may have kept the knowledge private. What is in these uninvestigated caves what they could tell us if they were properly excavated and studied, is one of the great unknowns of southwestern archaeology. The potential is enormous. Every major cave excavation in the Southwest has yielded significant findings, has added to our understanding of the region's human history. But the resources for professional archaeology are limited. There are not enough archaeologists, not enough funding, not enough time to investigate every site. Priorities have to be set. Sites that are threatened by erosion or by development or by looting are prioritized. Sites that are likely to yield particularly important information based on surface indications or on their location or on other factors are prioritized. But many sites remain uninvestigated simply because the resources are not available. And some sites are kept uninvestigated deliberately, are protected by their remoteness, by their difficulty of access, by the decision that the best way to preserve them is to leave them alone, to not excavate, to not publicize, to allow them to remain as they are. Time capsules sealed by the dry desert, air waiting for a future, when perhaps the techniques for investigation are better, when the resources are greater. When the relationship between archaeologists and indigenous communities has evolved to the point where the investigation can be done in ways that honor the cultural significance of these places to the peoples whose ancestors created them. The relationship between contemporary indigenous peoples and the ancient cave sites of the Southwest is complex, profound, and often misunderstood by outsiders. The term Ancestral Puebloan, which archaeologists use to describe the cultures that flourished in the Four Corners region from roughly 100 AD to 1300 AD, is itself a compromised term, replacing the older term Anasazi, which was derived from a Navajo word, and which some Puebloan peoples found inappropriate. The ancestral Puebloans are not a vanished people. They are the ancestors of the contemporary Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona, the Hopi and the Zuni, and the peoples of the Rio Grande Pueblos communities that maintain continuous cultural traditions going back more than 1,000 years. Communities for whom the ancient sites, including the cave dwellings and the rock shelters, are not archaeological resources, but are ancestral places, are part of living cultural heritage, are in some cases still sacred sites where ceremonies are performed or where access is restricted by cultural protocols that predate any modern land management regime. This creates a tension in the archaeological study of Southwest caves. From the archaeological perspective, these sites are resources for understanding the human past, are collections of data that can be excavated and analyzed and interpreted to build knowledge about ancient lifeways, about cultural development, about the processes of adaptation and change. From the indigenous perspective, these sites are ancestral homes, are the footprints of the people who came before, are places that hold spiritual power, are connected to origin stories and migration narratives and cosmological understandings that are still relevant, still meaningful, still part of the living culture. Professional archaeology has evolved significantly in its approach to these issues over the past several decades. The passage of the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 established legal frameworks for consultation with tribes, for the treatment of human remains and sacred objects, for the repatriation of materials that were excavated in earlier periods when consultation was not standard practice. Most archaeological work in the Southwest now involves tribal consultation from the beginning of the project, includes tribal representatives in decision-making, respects tribal requests about what should and should not be excavated, what should and should not be published, what should remain confidential. But the legacy of earlier archaeology, of excavations done without consultation, of artifacts removed and placed in museums far from their places of origin, of sites that were damaged or destroyed in the name of science, that legacy remains. And the contemporary practice, while improved, is still negotiating the fundamental tension between the archaeological impulse to know and the indigenous right to control access to ancestral places and materials. Some Pueblo communities have chosen to work closely with archaeologists to allow excavation and study under controlled conditions, to participate in the interpretation of findings, to use archaeological information to support cultural preservation efforts, and to educate younger generations about ancestral lifeways. Other communities have chosen to restrict access, to prohibit or severely limit archaeological work on lands they control, to keep certain sites and certain knowledge within the community protected from outside scrutiny. Both approaches are legitimate. And the result is that some of the most significant cave sites in the Southwest are off-limits to archaeological investigation, not because of looting concerns or because of physical inaccessibility, but because the indigenous communities who have cultural affiliation with the sites have decided that the sites should not be disturbed, that what is there should remain there, that the ancestors should be allowed to rest. This is important context for understanding why the caves are forbidden, why access is restricted, why so much remains unknown. It is not just about physical preservation or about preventing looting. It is about respecting the rights of living communities to make decisions about their own cultural heritage, about the places and the materials and the knowledge that connect them to their past. Let me turn now to the cliff dwellings, the most visible and most famous category of cave sites in the Southwest, because they illustrate both the extraordinary achievements of ancient peoples and the complexities of preservation and access in the contemporary landscape. The cliff dwellings of the Southwest, the multi-room masonry structures built in large alcoves and caves, are among the most iconic archaeological sites in North America. Mesa Verde in Colorado, with its Cliff Palace and Spruce Tree House and Balcony House, is a national park visited by hundreds of thousands of people annually. Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, with its White House ruins and other cliff dwellings, is a national monument managed cooperatively by the National Park Service and the Navajo Nation. Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico, Walnut Canyon in Arizona, numerous other sites across the Four Corners region. These are places where you can see, where you can sometimes enter with a guide, the structures that ancestral Puebloan peoples built in caves between roughly 1100 and 1300 AD. These cliff dwellings are extraordinary for several reasons. First, the engineering and construction. building multi-story masonry structures in alcoves that are often hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, accessible only by precarious hand-and-toe-hold trails or by ladders, required planning and skill and enormous labor investment. The stone for the walls had to be gathered, shaped, carried to the site. The mortar had to be prepared. The roof beams, substantial timbers, had to be cut and transporting, often from considerable distances, because trees large enough to serve as beams do not grow in the immediate vicinity of many cliff-dwelling sites. The construction had to be done in a confined space, in an alcove with limited room to maneuver with the constant risk of falling. Second, the locations. The cliff dwellings are in places that are defensible, that offer protection from enemies, that are sheltered from the elements, that maintain relatively stable temperatures year-round, cool in summer and warmer than the exposed mesa tops in winter. But they are also in places that are difficult to access, that require residents to climb up and down daily to reach fields and water sources that are not convenient in the ordinary sense. The choice to build in these locations, the investment of labor required, suggests that the defensive and environmental benefits outweighed the costs, suggests that by the late 1200s, when most of the cliff dwellings were built, the ancestral Puebloans were facing pressures possibly from warfare, possibly from resource scarcity, possibly from social or religious factors. That made the protected alcove sites desirable despite their challenges. Third, the abandonment. By 1300 AD, the cliff dwellings and the larger Four Corners region were largely abandoned. The ancestral Puebloans migrated, moved south and east, to the Rio Grande Valley, to the Hopi Mesas, to Zuni, to the regions where their descendants live today. The reasons for this migration, for the abandonment of the cliff dwellings and the great pueblos of the Four Corners, have been debated for decades. The evidence points to a combination of factors. A prolonged drought in the late 1200s, documented through tree-ring analysis, would have made agriculture difficult, would have stressed water supplies. Environmental degradation from centuries of farming and tree cutting may have reduced the productivity of the land. Warfare or social conflict may have made the region unstable. Religious or social transformations may have motivated the migration for reasons that the material record does not clearly reveal. Whatever the reasons, the ancestral Puebloans left. They left behind the cliff dwellings, the structures intact, the roof beams still in place, pottery vessels on the floors, in some cases food stores still in the storage rooms. They left in a way that suggests they intended to return, or they left in a way that suggests the departure was organized, deliberate, not a panicked flight, but a planned migration. And for 700 years, the cliff dwellings stood empty, protected by their alcoves, preserved by the dry climate, until they were encountered by Spanish explorers, by American settlers, by archaeologists, by the tourists and the looters and the preservationists who have all had their impact on these places. The famous cliff dwellings, the ones in the national parks and monuments, are protected now. They are stabilized against collapse, are monitored for deterioration, are accessed only through controlled tours that limit the number of visitors and that prohibit touching the walls or removing anything. But these are a small fraction of the total. There are hundreds of cliff dwellings across the Southwest that are not in national parks, that are on other federal lands or on state lands or on private lands or on tribal lands, that are not developed for tourism, that are not regularly monitored, that are vulnerable. And there are cliff dwellings in places so remote, so difficult to access, that they have never been formally investigated, that are known from aerial surveys or from reports by climbers, but that have never been entered by archaeologists. That may contain materials and information that would be significant, but that are protected by their inaccessibility and by the decision of land managers to leave them undisturbed. One such site is in a canyon system in northern Arizona, on land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, in a wilderness area where motorized access is prohibited and where the terrain is so rugged that even reaching the general area requires a multi-day backpacking trip. The cliff dwelling is in an alcove roughly 300 feet above the canyon floor, visible from certain vantage points with binoculars, but accessible only by a technical climb that requires rope work and considerable climbing skill. The site was documented from below in the 1970s, was photographed, was recorded in the BLM site files. The photographs show a multi-room masonry structure, intact walls, visible roof beams, a structure that appears to be in excellent condition despite 7 centuries of abandonment. No archaeologist has entered this site. The access is too difficult, the risk too high, the justification for disturbing it too weak, given that there are other cliff dwellings that are more accessible and that can provide similar information. The site is monitored periodically from below, is checked to ensure that it has not been looted, though the difficulty of access makes looting unlikely. And it remains as it has been for 700 years, a time capsule, a structure built by people who are gone, preserved by stone and by remoteness, and by the decision to let it be. What is inside this cliff dwelling? What artifacts are on the floors? What organic materials might be preserved in the dry alcove environment? What information it could provide about the people who built it and lived in it? These are questions that remain unanswered, and they may remain unanswered indefinitely. Because the cost and risk of accessing the site are difficult to justify when the broader patterns of ancestral Puebloan life are already well understood from other sites, when the archaeological community has limited resources and many sites to consider. When the preservation philosophy has shifted toward leaving sites undisturbed unless there is a compelling reason to excavate. This is one of the forbidden caves, forbidden by remoteness, by difficulty, by the judgment that it is better preserved by being left alone. Let me shift now to the rock art, to the images that cover the walls of caves and rock shelters across the Southwest, because the rock art is one of the most visible and one of the most mysterious categories of evidence from these sites. And because the interpretation of rock art raises fundamental questions about how we understand the worldviews and the spiritual lives of ancient peoples. Rock art in the Southwest appears in 2 primary forms: petroglyphs, images pecked or carved into the rock surface, removing the dark desert varnish to expose lighter stone beneath, creating images that are durable, that can last for thousands of years with minimal fading. And pictographs, images painted on the rock surface using pigments derived from minerals and plants, images that are more fragile, that can fade or wash away, but that in the protected environment of dry caves can also last for millennia. The rock art of the Southwest spans the entire period of human occupation. The earliest images, abstract geometric forms, and large anthropomorphic figures may date to the Archaic period, 3,000 or more years ago. The styles evolved over time, became more elaborate, incorporated new motifs, reflected the changing cultures and cosmologies of the peoples who made them. By the ancestral Puebloan period, the rock art includes complex panels with multiple figures, depicting humans and animals and supernatural beings, incorporating symbols that appear in other media, in pottery designs, and in kiva murals, and in the oral traditions that have been maintained by descendant communities. The interpretation of rock art is difficult because the images do not come with explanations, because the people who made them did not leave written accounts of what the images mean, because meaning in visual symbols is culturally specific and can be opaque to outsiders. Archaeologists and rock art specialists approach interpretation cautiously, using multiple lines of evidence. The formal analysis of the images, what is depicted, how it is depicted, what the composition and the style tell us. The contextual analysis, where the images are located, what other features are associated with them, whether they are in habitation sites or in remote ceremonial locations. The comparative analysis, looking at similar images in different locations, tracking the distribution of specific motifs across the landscape. And the ethnographic analysis, consulting with contemporary indigenous peoples whose oral traditions and religious practices may preserve knowledge about the meanings of certain symbols. What emerges from this careful interpretive work is not a complete decoding, not a dictionary that translates image to meaning, but a framework for understanding the rock art as a form of communication, as a way of expressing cosmological knowledge, as a marker of sacred space, as a record of visions or spiritual experiences, as a way of connecting with the divine or with ancestral powers. Some rock art panels are clearly narrative, depict scenes that tell stories, hunting scenes or ceremonial scenes or migration stories. Some are clearly symbolic, use abstract forms that recur across different sites and that appear to represent concepts or beings or cosmological structures. Some are located in places that are still recognized by contemporary Puebloan peoples as sacred, where ceremonies are still performed, where the rock art is understood to be part of the spiritual infrastructure of the site, not decoration, but an integral element of the place's power. And some rock art is in places that are completely inaccessible, that require technical climbing to reach, that are not visible from any normal vantage point, that seem to have been made not to be seen by human eyes, but to be seen by other than human beings, by the spirits or the gods or the forces that inhabit the landscape in indigenous cosmologies. There is a pictograph panel in a cave in southeastern Utah, in a sandstone alcove high on a cliff face, accessible only by a difficult climb. The panel covers a section of the cave wall, perhaps 10 feet wide and 6 feet high. The images are painted in red and white pigments, depicting a complex scene with multiple human figures, some realistic and some stylized, some holding objects that might be ceremonial staffs or weapons, some in postures that suggest dancing or ritual action. There are animal figures, bighorn sheep and birds. There are geometric forms, spirals and concentric circles and zigzag lines. And there are figures that do not correspond to anything in the natural world, beings with elaborate headdresses or with body forms that are not human, that seem to represent supernatural entities. The panel was documented in the 1990s by a team of rock art specialists working under permit. They photographed it, recorded its dimensions and its location, analyzed the pigments using non-invasive techniques to determine their composition. The pigments are mineral-based, iron oxides for the reds, calcium compounds for the whites. Radiocarbon dating of organic binders in the paint was attempted but was inconclusive. Based on stylistic analysis, comparison with other rock art in the region, the panel is attributed to the ancestral Puebloan period, probably between 1000 and 1200 AD. The meaning of the panel is unknown. Consultation with Puebloan cultural advisors provided some insights, confirmed that some of the symbols are recognizable from oral traditions, that the panel likely represents a ceremonial scene or a cosmological narrative, but the specific details, what story is being told, what ceremony is being depicted, remain uncertain. The location of the panel, high on a cliff in a remote canyon, suggests that it was not made for casual viewing, that reaching it was part of the purpose, that the act of making the images in this difficult location was itself significant. The panel is not publicized. The location is kept confidential. The photographs are in archives available to researchers, but the site is not marked, is not visited except by the occasional rock art specialist or by climbers who happen to find it. And it remains there, the pigments fading slowly under the influence of light and air and time, but still visible, still asking to be understood, still carrying whatever message its makers intended, a message that we can see but cannot fully hear. This is typical of much of the rock art in Southwest caves, visible, documented to varying degrees, interpreted cautiously, protected by restricted access, holding meanings that are partially recoverable and partially lost. There are thousands of rock art sites in the Southwest. Many are recorded in state and federal site files. Many are not, exist only in the knowledge of the people who have found them. The systematic documentation of Southwest rock art is an ongoing project, one that will take decades to complete. One that is complicated by the difficulty of access, by the remoteness of many sites, by the sensitivity of the locations, by the legitimate concerns about publicizing sites and thereby making them vulnerable to vandalism. Vandalism of rock art is a serious problem. People scratch their names over ancient images, shoot at the panels, spray paint graffiti, remove sections of painted or pecked rock for private collections. Once damaged, rock art cannot be restored. The images are gone, the information is lost, the connection to the past is severed. This is why access to many rock art sites is restricted, why locations are kept secret, why even researchers who are documenting sites are often asked not to publish precise locational information. The tension between sharing knowledge and protecting sites is constant. The public has a legitimate interest in knowing about the cultural heritage of the Southwest, in seeing the extraordinary art that ancient peoples created. But that public interest has to be balanced against the need to preserve the sites, to prevent damage, to respect the wishes of descendant communities who may consider the sites sacred and may not want them treated as tourist attractions. Some rock art sites have been developed for public access, with trails and interpretive signs and measures to protect the panels from touching or vandalism. Newspaper rock in Utah, the petroglyph panels in Petroglyph National Monument in New Mexico, 9 Mile Canyon in Utah. These are places where people can see rock art legally and where the sites are managed to minimize damage. But these are a small fraction of the total. Most rock art sites remain unmanaged, are protected only by their remoteness or by the lack of public knowledge about their locations. And then there are the images that do not fit easily into the established typologies, the rock art that raises questions about cultural contact, about the extent of trade networks, about the possibility that peoples from outside the Southwest visited or influenced the region in ways that the standard narratives do not account for. I want to be careful here because the interpretation of anomalous rock art has been a favorite subject of alternative archaeology, of claims about ancient aliens or pre-Columbian European contact or other theories that are not supported by the broader archaeological evidence. Most rock art that seems anomalous, that seems to depict something unexpected, can be explained within the framework of indigenous Southwest cultures, can be understood as stylistic variation, or as depictions of mythological beings, or as images that seem strange to us because we do not share the cultural knowledge that would make them comprehensible. But there are a few cases, a very few, where the images are difficult to explain, where they seem to suggest knowledge of things or places or beings that the makers should not, according to our current understanding, have known about. There is a pictograph panel in a cave in New Mexico, documented in the 1980s, that includes among its images what appears to be a ship, a large vessel with a mast and rigging, depicted in a style that does not match any other indigenous rock art in the region. The image is enigmatic. Ships of the type depicted were not used by indigenous peoples of the interior Southwest. The nearest ocean is hundreds of miles away. Spanish ships sailed along the California coast and the Gulf of California beginning in the 1540s, but this is far from the coast. And the radiocarbon date from organic material in the pigment, if it is reliable, places the image at 1200 AD, more than 300 years before Spanish contact. The standard interpretation is that the image is not a ship, that it represents something else, a stylized animal or a ceremonial structure or a mythological being, and that the resemblance to a ship is pareidolia, is us seeing what we expect to see rather than what is actually there. This is probably correct. The image is ambiguous. It could be interpreted in multiple ways, and the tendency to see familiar forms in ambiguous images is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. But the image remains interesting, remains a data point, that does not quite fit. That raises the question of whether there are connections and contacts in the ancient Southwest that we have not yet understood, whether the flow of information and goods and ideas across the pre-Columbian Americas was more extensive than we have assumed. This is a question that can only be answered by more research, by more careful documentation, by more comparative analysis. And it is a question where the cave sites of the Southwest, with their preserved artifacts and their protected rock art, have the potential to provide crucial evidence. If they can be studied properly, if access can be negotiated, if the work can be done in ways that respect the sites and the communities that have cultural connections to them. The preservation of organic materials in Southwest caves has allowed archaeologists to recover artifacts that provide extraordinarily detailed information about ancient technologies, about daily life, about the specific skills and knowledge that people possessed and passed down through generations. Nowhere is this more evident than in the basketry and textile collections that have been excavated from dry cave sites across the region. Basketry in the Southwest goes back thousands of years. The earliest examples from archaic period contexts dating to 7,000 or 8,000 years ago are simple plaited or twined constructions, utilitarian containers made from readily available plant materials, yucca leaves, willow shoots, grass stems. But even these early baskets show technical competence, show understanding of the properties of different fibers, show the ability to create functional containers that are watertight or nearly so, that can be used for gathering seeds and nuts, for parching grain over fire, for storing food. By the basket maker period, the tradition had become extraordinarily sophisticated. The term basket maker, which archaeologists use for the early ancestral Puebloan peoples from roughly 500 BC to 750 AD, was chosen specifically because of the quality and the abundance of the basketry found in sites from this period. The baskets from basket maker sites show a wide range of forms and techniques, coiled baskets, with intricate geometric designs worked into the coil patterns, twined burden baskets large enough to carry substantial loads, shallow trays for winnowing grain, tightly woven water bottles sealed with pitch cradle boards for carrying infants. Sandals woven with patterns that are both decorative and functional, providing traction and durability. The level of skill represented in these objects is remarkable. Modern basket makers who have studied the ancient examples, who have attempted to reproduce the techniques, report that making baskets of this quality requires years of practice, requires intimate knowledge of plant materials, and their seasonal variations requires the kind of hand-eye coordination and fine motor control that comes only with extensive experience. A well-made coiled basket might take 50 or 100 hours to complete. The person making it had to gather the materials at the right season, had to prepare them properly, had to plan the design, had to execute the work with precision and patience. And these were not ceremonial objects made for special purposes. These were everyday tools, were containers that were used and worn out and replaced. The abundance of basketry in the archaeological record, the fact that caves often contain dozens or hundreds of basket fragments, indicates that basket making was a common skill, that it was knowledge held and practiced by many people, that it was fundamental to the subsistence economy. But the baskets also show individual variation, show personal style, show that within the shared tradition there was room for creativity and experimentation. Two baskets of the same general type, made in the same period in the same region, will show differences in the tightness of the weave, in the specific patterns used, in the proportions, in the small details that mark them as the work of different hands. And when you look at a basket closely enough, when the preservation is good enough, you can sometimes see the fingerprints of the maker pressed into the fibers, visible after 3,000 years, a direct physical connection to the person who made this object, who sat somewhere in this landscape and wove these fibers and left this mark. This kind of preservation, this level of detail, is almost never available in archaeological contexts outside of dry caves. And it changes what we can know about ancient peoples, changes the questions we can ask, allows us to move from general statements about cultures and periods to specific observations about individuals and communities and the transmission of knowledge. The textiles from Southwest caves show a similar trajectory from simple to sophisticated. The earliest textiles are twined fabrics made from plant fibers, similar in technique to basketry but finer, more flexible, used for clothing and blankets. By the Puebloan period, cotton had been introduced, had been adopted for cultivation, and was being woven into cloth using true looms, frame looms with heddles that allowed the creation of complex patterns, fabrics with stripes and checks, and geometric designs. The cotton textiles from late Puebloan period cave sites are extraordinary. The weaving is tight and even, the patterns are precise, the fabrics are soft and durable. These are not crude primitive cloths. These are textiles that would be considered high quality by any standard, that represent mastery of a complex technology, that show the same kind of skill and aesthetic sensibility that is visible in the basketry and in the pottery and in the architecture. And the textiles tell us things about trade networks, about connections between different regions. Cotton does not grow well in the high elevations and short growing seasons of the Four Corners region. The cotton that was being woven into cloth at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon was being grown somewhere else, probably in the lower elevations of southern Arizona or northern Mexico, and was being traded. North was moving through exchange networks that connected the Southwest to Mesoamerica. That brought shells from the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast, that brought macaw feathers from the tropics, that brought copper bells and other exotic goods that appear in ancestral Puebloan sites. The extent and the nature of these trade networks is one of the active areas of research in southwestern archaeology. The material evidence is clear. Objects from distant sources are found in southwest sites. But the mechanisms of trade, whether it was direct contact between distant groups or whether goods moved through chains of intermediate exchanges, whether there were specialized traders or whether exchange was embedded in social and religious relationships, these questions are more difficult to answer. And here again, the caves are crucial sources of evidence, because the dry cave environment preserves not just stone and pottery, but also the exotic organic materials, the feathers and the textiles and the wooden objects that are indicators of long-distance exchange. A Puebloan cave site might yield a handful of macaw feathers, bright red and blue and yellow, feathers from birds that live in the tropical forests of Mexico, 1,000 miles away. The feathers were valuable, were used in ceremonies, were incorporated into ritual costumes and prayer sticks. Their presence in the Southwest indicates contact, indicates that there were pathways, physical and social, that connected the Pueblos to Mesoamerica. Whether those pathways included the movement of people, whether Mesoamerican traders or pilgrims or migrants ever traveled to the Southwest, or whether Southwestern peoples traveled south, is a question that has generated debate. The standard interpretation is that the contact was indirect, that goods moved through chains of exchange, that there was no significant population movement. But there are hints in the archaeological record, artifacts and architectural features and iconographic elements that seem to have Mesoamerican affinities, that raise the possibility of more direct contact. One of the most intriguing finds in this context comes from a cave in southwestern New Mexico, a site that was excavated in the 1960s and that yielded, among other materials, a small copper bell. The bell is of a type that is well known from Mesoamerican contexts, a cast copper bell with a loop for suspension and a small pellet inside that creates a ringing sound when the bell is shaken. Chemical analysis of the copper showed that it came from sources in West Mexico, confirmed that this was an imported object, not something made locally. Copper bells of this type have been found in small numbers at a few dozen sites across the Southwest, always in contexts that suggest they were valuable, that they were ceremonial objects, that they were rare and exotic. The bells date to the period between roughly 1000 and 1450 AD, the time when the great Pueblos were flourishing, when trade networks were most extensive. The bells themselves are evidence of contact with Mesoamerica. But they do not tell us who was doing the traveling, who was facilitating the trade. Did Mesoamerican traders bring the bells north? Did Southwestern peoples travel south to obtain them? Were there intermediaries, groups living in northern Mexico who mediated the exchange? The bells cannot answer these questions. They are objects without the context that would reveal the full story of how they got here. But the fact that they are here, that they were valued enough to be deposited in burials and in ceremonial caches, that they appear across a wide geographic area, indicates that the Southwest was not isolated, that it was part of a broader world of interaction and exchange that extended across much of Western North America and into Mesoamerica. And this raises the question of what else might have moved along these networks, not just objects, but ideas, religious concepts, agricultural techniques, architectural styles, stories and songs, and cosmological understandings. Cultural influence is harder to trace than trade goods, because influence can be subtle, can be adapted and transformed as it moves, can become so integrated into the receiving culture that its origins are no longer visible. But the possibility that the complex societies of the ancestral Puebloans were influenced by contact with Mesoamerica, that some of their religious practices or their political organization or their agricultural innovations had roots in ideas that came from the south, is taken seriously by some archaeologists and is rejected by others. The evidence is ambiguous. There are similarities between Puebloan and Mesoamerican cultures, similarities in cosmology and in the use of directional symbolism and in certain architectural features. But there are also significant differences, and the similarities could be explained as independent developments, as parallel evolution of similar solutions to similar problems, rather than as evidence of direct influence. This is the kind of question where more evidence from well-preserved, well-documented cave sites could be crucial. If there are artifacts in Southwest caves that are unambiguously Mesoamerican, that cannot be explained as trade goods, but that suggest the actual presence of Mesoamerican peoples in the Southwest, that would be significant. If there are architectural features or rock art elements or burial practices that show clear Mesoamerican influence, that would support the case for cultural contact. But such evidence, if it exists, has not been conclusively demonstrated. The caves that have been excavated have yielded trade goods, have shown that exchange networks existed, but have not yielded the kind of evidence that would prove sustained direct contact or population movement. And many of the caves that might hold such evidence remain unexplored, remain inaccessible, remain forbidden. Let me turn now to a different kind of mystery, one that involves not the movement of objects or ideas across long distances, but the persistence of certain practices and certain places over extraordinary spans of time. There are caves in the Southwest that show evidence of use spanning thousands of years, not continuous use, but repeated use. The same place being returned to again and again by different peoples at different times for purposes that may have been similar or may have been entirely different. These are places that seem to have held significance across cultural boundaries, across the transitions from archaic to basket maker to Puebloan to historic indigenous groups. Places where the stone and the location and the shelter created a persistent attraction that transcended the specific cultural identities of the people who used them. One such place is a large rock shelter in southeastern Utah, in a canyon that has reliable water, a spring that flows year-round, creating a corridor of green in the Red Rock Desert. The rock shelter is massive, perhaps 200 feet wide and 100 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright anywhere inside. The floor of the shelter is covered with archaeological deposit, layers upon layers of sediment and ash and debris representing more than 8,000 years of intermittent human use. The site was excavated systematically in the 1970s, a multi-year project that went through the deposits carefully, that documented the stratigraphy, that radiocarbon dated the different levels, that established a chronology of occupation. The results were published in a monograph that remains one of the definitive studies of long-term use of a single site in the Southwest. The deepest levels of the deposit, dating to around 6000 BC, contained archaic period materials, the same kinds of artifacts found in other archaic sites: projectile points, grinding stones, basketry fragments, evidence of hunting and gathering, of seasonal use of the shelter. Above those levels, separated by relatively sterile sediment indicating periods when the shelter was not used or was used only lightly, were basket maker deposits from around 500 BC to 500 AD, with the characteristic pottery and architecture and increased emphasis on agriculture. Above those were Puebloan deposits from 700 to 1200 AD, with more pottery, with evidence of more intensive use, with features that suggested the shelter was being used not just as a seasonal camp, but as a more permanent habitation or as a ceremonial site. And above those, in the uppermost levels, were materials from the historic period, Navajo artifacts from the 18th and 19th centuries, evidence that even after the ancestral Puebloans left the region, the shelter continued to be used, continued to be valued for its location near water, for its protection from weather, for whatever other qualities made it a place worth returning to. What the excavation revealed was not just a sequence of occupations, but a pattern of selective reuse. Certain areas of the shelter were used again and again for specific purposes. A particular spot near the back wall showed evidence of hearths at multiple levels, indicated that this was the preferred location for fire, possibly because of good air circulation or because of the way smoke would exit the shelter. Another area near the front showed concentrations of chipped stone debris at multiple levels, indicated that this was where tool manufacture happened, where people sat and napped stone, generation after generation choosing the same spot for the same activity. Most striking were the rock art panels. The shelter walls are covered with petroglyphs and pictographs, hundreds of individual images overlapping and superimposed, created over thousands of years. The images show the full range of styles and periods: early archaic abstract forms, large anthropomorphic figures with elaborate body decorations, basket maker images, handprints, and geometric patterns. Puebloan images, depictions of animals and humans and supernatural beings, compositions that show narrative scenes, and historic Navajo images, horses and riders, incorporations of new subject matter reflecting the changed world of the post-contact period. The rock art at this site is a visual record of the site's use, a palimpsest where each generation added its marks to those that came before, where the wall became a cumulative document, not a single statement, but a conversation across millennia. And some of the images appear to have been deliberately positioned in relation to earlier images, suggest that the later image makers were aware of what was already there, were adding to it, were responding to it. This kind of long-term, repeated use of a single place raises questions about cultural memory, about the transmission of knowledge about places, about how information about significant sites is maintained and passed down even through periods of cultural change and population turnover. The Navajo who used this shelter in the 1800s were not the direct descendants of the archaic peoples who used it 6,000 years earlier. The cultural continuity, if any, is indirect, is mediated through the Puebloan period and through whatever knowledge about the landscape was maintained in oral traditions. And yet the Navajo chose to use the same shelter, chose to add their images to the walls, chose to continue a tradition of marking this place that goes back to the beginning of human presence in the region. Whether they knew the shelter was ancient, whether they recognized the earlier images as the work of previous peoples, whether they understood the site as a place with a long history, we do not know. But the pattern suggests that some places in the landscape hold a kind of power, a magnetism that transcends specific cultures, that makes them persistently significant. These are often places with specific physical characteristics: reliable water, good shelter, commanding views, locations that are inherently advantageous or inherently striking. But the significance can also be cultural, can be built up over time through the accumulation of human activity, through the stories that are told about the place, through the rituals that are performed there, through the sense that this is a place where the ancestors were, where the boundary between past and present is thin, where the landscape remembers. For contemporary Puebloan and other indigenous peoples, many of the ancient cave sites are places like this. They are not abandoned ruins. They are ancestral places, are part of the cultural geography. Are locations that figure in origin stories and migration narratives, are sometimes still visited for ceremonies, are protected by cultural protocols about who can go there and what can be done there, and what knowledge about them can be shared with outsiders. This is another dimension of why the caves are forbidden, not just because of looting concerns or physical fragility, but because they are sacred, because they belong in a cultural and spiritual sense to the indigenous communities whose ancestors created them. Because access to them is governed by cultural laws that predate and supersede any federal or state land management regime. The intersection of archaeological interest and indigenous rights is one of the most complex and most important issues in contemporary southwestern archaeology. The tensions are real. Archaeologists want to study the sites, want to excavate and analyze and publish, want to build knowledge that is publicly available, that contributes to the understanding of human history. Indigenous communities want to protect the sites, want to control what is done with the remains of their ancestors, want to maintain the spiritual and cultural integrity of places that are still meaningful, still powerful, still part of living traditions. The resolution of these tensions, when resolution is possible, comes through dialogue, through relationship building, through the development of protocols that respect both the scientific value of the sites and the cultural values of the descendant communities. Some tribes have developed their own archaeology programs, have trained tribal members as archaeologists, have taken control of the investigation and interpretation of sites on tribal lands. Some have established partnerships with universities and museums, have created collaborative research projects where tribal representatives and professional archaeologists work together, where the research questions and the methods are negotiated, where the findings are shared. But some tribes have chosen not to allow archaeological work at all, have decided that the sites should be left alone, that the ancestors should not be disturbed, that the knowledge held in the sites is not meant to be extracted and publicized, but is meant to remain where it is, protected by the earth and by the stone and by the cultural protocols that keep outsiders away. This is a legitimate choice. And it means that some of what is in the Southwest caves will remain unknown, will remain part of the hidden history, will be preserved not through documentation and museum curation, but through deliberate non-disturbance, through the decision to honor the past by not intruding upon it. There is a deep respect in this approach, a recognition that not everything needs to be known, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, that the relationship between the living and the dead is not purely a matter of scientific inquiry, but is also a matter of spiritual and ethical responsibility. And yet the archaeologist in me, the part that is driven by curiosity, by the desire to know, by the conviction that understanding the past is valuable and important, feels the tension. There are questions that could be answered if the forbidden caves could be investigated. There is information that could be recovered, artifacts that could be studied, knowledge that could be added to the sum of human understanding. But the recognition that science is not the only value, that indigenous rights and cultural preservation are equally important. That the decision about whether to excavate should not be made by archaeologists alone, but should include the voices of the peoples whose ancestors are being studied. This recognition has become fundamental to how archaeology is practiced in the Southwest and increasingly across North America. The forbidden caves will remain forbidden, many of them protected by law and by ethics and by respect. And what they hold will remain largely unknown, except to those who have the cultural authority to access them, to know them, to maintain the relationship with them that has been maintained for generations. This is not a failure of archaeology. This is archaeology recognizing its limits, recognizing that the past belongs not just to scientists, but to the descendants of the people who created it, recognizing that preservation can take many forms, and that sometimes the best preservation is to leave things as they are. Let me describe one final site, one that illustrates the extraordinary potential of Southwest caves and the complexities of studying them responsibly. The site is in a canyon in northern New Mexico, on land that is now part of a national forest, but that was, until the mid-20th century, in private hands, part of a ranch. The canyon is deep and narrow, with sheer sandstone walls rising hundreds of feet. Near the head of the canyon, accessible by a route that requires scrambling up a steep tailless slope and then traversing a narrow ledge, there is an alcove, not large, perhaps 50 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a low ceiling that slopes down toward the back. The alcove was known to the ranchers who owned the land. They had been inside, had seen that there were artifacts on the surface, potsherds and stone tools, had known that it was an archaeological site but had never reported it, had kept it as a kind of family secret. When the land was sold to the Forest Service in the 1950s, the site became federal property, became subject to federal antiquities laws, but it was remote and the Forest Service did not immediately survey it, did not know the site was there. In the 1980s, a hiker exploring the canyon found the site, reported it to the Forest Service. An archaeologist was sent to investigate, to document the site, to assess its significance. What the archaeologist found was astonishing. The alcove floor was covered with intact deposits. There had been no looting, no disturbance beyond the occasional visits by the ranching family who had apparently been respectful, had looked but not taken. The surface showed pottery, basketry, cordage, the kinds of materials that are usually absent from surface contexts, but that were here, exposed, accessible. Preliminary assessment suggested that the deposits were deep, that the site had been used intensively, that excavation would almost certainly yield significant information. The archaeologist recommended that the site be protected, that it be gated or fenced to prevent access, that a research excavation be undertaken to document it properly. The recommendation was approved, but before the excavation could begin, there was consultation with Puebloan tribes who have cultural affiliation with the region. The tribes expressed concerns. The site, based on its location and its characteristics, was identified as a place that might have ceremonial significance, that might contain materials or features that should not be disturbed. The tribes requested that the site not be excavated, that it be protected but left intact. The Forest Service, the archaeologists, and the tribes negotiated. The outcome was a compromise. A minimal investigation would be allowed, surface collection of artifacts that were exposed and at risk of being scattered by animals or weather, documentation of features that were visible without excavation, radiocarbon dating of charcoal from a surface hearth to establish the age of the occupation. But no excavation into the intact deposits. The site would be recorded, would be monitored, would be protected by its remoteness and by the decision not to publicize its location, but it would not be dug. The surface collection yielded a small assemblage of artifacts, enough to establish that the site dates to the late Puebloan period, around 1200 to 1300 AD, enough to show that the materials are well preserved, that the baskets and the textiles are in excellent condition despite being 700 years old. The radiocarbon date confirmed the age. The documentation established the site's significance, and then the site was left. The artifacts that were collected were curated, are available for research. The photographs and the field notes are in the archives. The location is in the site files, confidential, protected. And the site itself remains, the intact deposits still in the alcove, the baskets and the pottery, and whatever else is there still in the ground, preserved by the dry environment and by the decision not to disturb them. What could be learned if that site were excavated properly? What information is in those deposits about late Puebloan life, about subsistence, about technology, about social organization? What artifacts are there that could be studied, that could be added to the collections that inform our understanding of this period? These are real questions, and the answers would be valuable. But the decision was made that the value of preserving the site intact, of respecting the wishes of the descendant community, of not disturbing what may be a sacred place, outweighs the value of the information that could be gained through excavation. And that decision stands. This is the reality of the forbidden caves of the Southwest. Some are forbidden by inaccessibility, by remoteness, by physical danger. Some are forbidden by law, protected under antiquities legislation, off-limits without permits that are difficult to obtain. Some are forbidden by ethical commitment, by the recognition that descendant communities have the right to control what happens to the remains of their ancestors and to the places that are part of their cultural heritage. And the result is that much of what is in the Southwest caves remains unknown, remains hidden, remains part of the silent history that the landscape holds, but does not easily reveal. The question of what we actually know about the 12,000 years of human history preserved in Southwest caves is both easier and harder to answer than it might seem. We know a great deal. More than a century of professional archaeology, thousands of excavated sites, hundreds of thousands of analyzed artifacts, decades of radiocarbon dating and ceramic analysis, and botanical studies and faunal analysis. All of this has built a detailed, well-supported framework for understanding the human past in the Southwest. We know the basic chronology, the sequence of cultures from Paleo-Indian through Archaic, through basket maker through Puebloan. We know the major transitions, the adoption of agriculture, the development of pottery, the shift from pit houses to above-ground masonry architecture, the aggregation into large pueblos, the eventual migration out of the Four Corners region. We know the technologies, how stone tools were made, how baskets were woven, how pottery was fired, how buildings were constructed. We know the subsistence strategies, what was hunted and gathered, what crops were grown, how food was processed and stored. We know the trade networks, what exotic goods were moving through the region and where they came from. This is substantial knowledge built on rigorous methods, supported by abundant evidence. The broad outlines of Southwest prehistory are well established and are not seriously disputed within the professional archaeological community. But the details, the specifics of individual communities and individual lives, the motivations and the beliefs, and the internal social dynamics, the specific events and decisions that shaped the trajectory of cultures over time, these are harder to recover. These require interpretation, require building models based on fragmentary evidence, require acknowledging the limits of what the material record can tell us. And this is where the caves become crucial, because the caves preserve the details, preserve the organic materials and the perishable items and the contexts that allow us to move from general patterns to specific observations. A sandal from a cave tells us not just that people wore sandals, which we could infer from other evidence, but exactly how the sandals were made, what materials were used, what patterns were woven into them, what wear patterns developed from use, what size feet the wearer had. A basket tells us about the specific plants that were available in a specific place at a specific time, about the skill level of the maker, about the purposes the basket was used for. A burial tells us about treatment of the dead, about what items were considered appropriate to accompany a person into the afterlife, about age and sex and health, and sometimes about cause of death. The accumulation of these details from multiple cave sites across the region allows archaeologists to build increasingly refined models of ancient lifeways, to track changes over time, to compare different regions and different periods, to identify patterns and variations. And the caves that remain uninvestigated, the forbidden caves, represent a vast reservoir of potential information, of details that could further refine our understanding, that could answer questions we have not yet been able to answer, that could raise new questions we have not yet thought to ask. But there is a limit to what archaeological evidence can tell us, even under the best circumstances, even with perfect preservation and unlimited resources for investigation. Material culture is the residue of human behavior, but it is not a complete record of human behavior. It is the durable remainder, the things that happen to survive, the things that were discarded or lost or deliberately cached, interpreted through the lens of archaeological method and theory. The thoughts and the conversations and the relationships and the emotions and the spiritual experiences of ancient peoples, these do not fossilize, do not leave physical traces that we can excavate and analyze. We can make inferences. We can use the material evidence in combination with ethnographic analogy, with insights from contemporary indigenous peoples about how similar materials and similar practices functioned in their cultures, with cross-cultural anthropological models about how human societies generally organize themselves. And these inferences can be productive, can give us frameworks for understanding the past that are more complete than what the artifacts alone would provide. But they are inferences, not direct knowledge. They are educated guesses, more or less well supported, depending on the quality of the evidence and the rigor of the reasoning, but still separated from the actual lived experience of the ancient peoples by an unbridgeable gap. The rock art is particularly revealing of this gap. We can see the images, can document them, can analyze their formal properties and their distributions and their associations. But we cannot know with certainty what they meant to the people who made them, cannot know what narratives they were telling, what cosmological truths they were expressing, what visions or experiences they were recording. The images are there, speaking across the centuries, but we can only partially hear what they are saying. Contemporary Puebloan peoples, when they look at ancient rock art, sometimes recognize elements, can connect specific symbols to oral traditions, can identify images that are still meaningful in current religious practices. This knowledge is valuable, is one of the ways that the gap between ancient and contemporary can be partially bridged. But even this knowledge is incomplete because the cultures have changed, because 700 years or 1,000 years or 3,000 years is a long time. Because oral traditions evolve and transform, because not all knowledge has been transmitted continuously, because some things were lost in the disruptions of the Spanish conquest and the subsequent centuries of cultural pressure and change. And some knowledge is deliberately kept private, is not shared with archaeologists or with the public, is protected as sacred knowledge that belongs within the community. This is appropriate, and it is frustrating. Appropriate because the descendant communities have the right to maintain their own cultural knowledge in their own ways. Frustrating because it means that there are dimensions of the ancient past that we will not be able to access through archaeological research. That will remain known only to those who have the cultural authority to hold that knowledge. The result is that the caves, even the ones that have been investigated, even the ones that have yielded abundant artifacts and detailed stratigraphic sequences, remain partially mysterious. They tell us much, but they do not tell us everything. They preserve the material dimension of ancient lives, but not the full human dimension. They are archives, but archives with gaps, with silences, with information that has been lost or that was never recorded in a form that would survive. Let me speak now about the experience of being in these places, because the physical experience of entering an ancient cave site, of standing in a space that was inhabited thousands of years ago, is part of what draws people to these places, and part of what makes the question of access so charged. I have been in Southwest cave sites with permits, with archaeological supervision, following the protocols that are meant to protect the sites while allowing limited research access. The experience is profound in ways that are difficult to articulate. You approach the site through the landscape that the ancient inhabitants knew, walk the same canyons, see the same rock formations, the same sky. The landscape has changed, the vegetation has changed, the climate has shifted, but the fundamental geography is the same. The cliffs are where they were, the alcoves are where they were, carved by the same processes that carved them millions of years ago. You enter the cave and the temperature drops, the air becomes still, the sounds of the outside world fade. Your eyes adjust to the dimmer light, to the shadows in the back of the alcove, to the subtle variations in the rock surfaces. And then you see the evidence of human presence. A low wall of stacked stone, a remnant of a structure built to divide the alcove into rooms. A hearth, a circle of fire-reddened stones, ash still visible in the soil. Potsherds on the surface, pieces of broken vessels, some with painted designs, some plain. A fragment of basketry wedged between rocks, the weaving still visible despite centuries of exposure. And you realize that you are standing where people stood, where they lived, where they cooked and ate and slept and raised children and told stories and practiced rituals, and did all the ordinary and extraordinary things that humans do. The connection across time is visceral, is immediate in a way that looking at artifacts in a museum is not, because you are in the place, are surrounded by the same stone, are breathing air that has circulated through this alcove for millennia. If you are quiet, if you are attentive, you can almost feel the presence of the people who were here. Not literally, not as ghosts or spirits, but as a sense of accumulated human experience, of the weight of the years and the generations that unfolded in this place. The stone remembers nothing, is indifferent to the brief human presence, but you remember, or you imagine, or you allow yourself to be a bridge between the past and the present, to carry for a moment the awareness that this place was home to people who are gone now, who left these marks, who live on only in the fragments they left behind, and in the descendants who carry forward whatever cultural continuity has been maintained. This experience is powerful, and it is part of why people seek out these sites, why they hike for miles and climb difficult routes and ignore the restrictions, why the desire to see and to touch and to be in these places is so strong. And it is also why the sites need to be protected, because that desire, when it is uncontrolled, when it is multiplied across thousands of visitors, leads to damage, leads to the wearing away of features, the disturbance of deposits, the removal of artifacts, the gradual erosion of the very thing that makes the sites significant. The paradox is that the experience of being in an ancient site, the connection it creates, the respect and the wonder it can inspire, can also lead to greater commitment to protection, to preservation, to the ethics of leaving sites undisturbed. People who have been in these places, who have felt that connection, often become the strongest advocates for their preservation. But the access has to be controlled, has to be limited, has to be managed in ways that balance the value of the experience against the need to protect the sites for the future. Some sites are developed for public access, have trails and viewing platforms and interpretive signs, allow people to see and to understand while minimizing the impact. Mesa Verde, Bandelier, other national parks and monuments have found ways to share these places while protecting them. But these are a tiny fraction of the total. Most sites cannot support public visitation, are too fragile, too remote, too small. These remain off limits, are protected by their inaccessibility and by the active management that keeps them closed to all but a small number of researchers and tribal members who have legitimate reasons to be there. And this is as it should be. Not everything needs to be accessible to everyone. Some places are preserved best by being left alone, by being known about but not visited, by being held in trust for the future rather than being consumed in the present. The caves of the Southwest are held in trust, held by the federal and state agencies that manage the public lands where many of them are located, held by the private landowners who choose to protect sites on their property rather than allowing them to be developed or looted, held by the indigenous communities who maintain cultural and spiritual relationships with the sites, held by the archaeologists who document and study them according to ethical standards that prioritize preservation, held by all of us collectively as part of the heritage of the human species, as part of the record of what we have been and where we have come from. The responsibility of that trust is to preserve what can be preserved, to study what can be studied in ways that do not destroy it, to share knowledge when sharing is appropriate, and to protect knowledge when protection is more important. To listen to the voices of descendant communities about how their ancestors should be treated and their ancestral places should be managed, and to accept that some questions will remain unanswered, that some caves will remain forbidden, that some mysteries will persist. There is value in mystery, not as an excuse for lazy thinking or for accepting unsubstantiated claims, but as a recognition that the world is larger and more complex than our knowledge of it, that the past is deep and much of it is irrecoverable. That silence and absence are part of the historical record as much as the artifacts and the documents. The Southwest Caves are not silent because nothing happened there. They are silent because the voices that filled them are gone, because the languages spoken in them are extinct or transformed, because the people who could explain what the rock art means and what the rituals were and what the stories were have been dead for centuries or for millennia. The caves hold the material traces of those lives, but not the lives themselves. And we, coming after, can study the traces, can build our models and our narratives, can try to understand. But we are always working from fragments, are always interpreting across a gap that cannot be fully closed, and yet the work is worthwhile. The careful excavation, the rigorous analysis, the publication of findings, the building of cumulative knowledge, this is how we honor the past. How we ensure that the people who lived these 12,000 years of human history in the Southwest are not completely forgotten, that their achievements are recognized, that their presence is acknowledged. The forbidden caves, the ones we cannot access, the ones that remain uninvestigated, are part of that same project of honoring the past. By protecting them, by leaving them intact, by choosing not to disturb them, we are saying that the past has value beyond what we can extract from it, that preservation is sometimes more important than knowledge, that the ancestors deserve rest, that sacred places deserve protection. This is a hard lesson for those of us who are driven by curiosity, who want to know, who see the potential for discovery and feel the pull of it. But it is a necessary lesson. The past belongs not just to us, not just to the present, but to the future, and to the peoples whose ancestors created it. Our role is not to consume it, not to extract everything we can from it, but to be stewards, to pass it on intact or as intact as possible, to allow future generations their own opportunity to engage with it, to learn from it, to be connected to it. The 12,000 years of human history in the Southwest Caves is a story that is still being written, still being discovered, still being understood. Each new excavation adds to it. Each new analysis refines it. Each conversation with Indigenous knowledge holders adds dimensions that the archaeological record alone cannot provide. The story is incomplete and will always be incomplete, but it is also rich and deep and significant, is a testament to human adaptability and creativity and persistence, is evidence that people have been making homes and making meaning in this landscape for longer than written history, for longer than most of the civilizations we learn about in school. For a span of time that reaches back to the end of the Ice Age and forward to the present moment. The caves are witnesses to this history. They have sheltered people through droughts and through plenty, through cultural fluorescence and through collapse, through periods of peace and periods of conflict. They have been homes and refuges and ceremonial spaces and burial places. They have been marked with images and modified with structures and filled with the debris of daily life. And then, for many of them, they have been abandoned, left to the silence, left to the slow work of geological time, left to wait for the moment when someone would return, would enter, would see what was there, and would try to understand. We are in that moment now, in the age of return, of rediscovery, of archaeological investigation and tribal reclamation and public interest. We are trying to understand, trying to preserve, trying to balance the competing values that these sites represent. And we are doing so imperfectly, with limited resources and incomplete knowledge and ongoing debates about methods and ethics and priorities. But the caves remain. They are patient in the way that stone is patient, in the way that geological time is patient. They have waited 12,000 years for us to develop the methods and the ethics and the relationships that allow us to approach them responsibly. They can wait longer. They can wait for better methods, for more resources, for deeper understanding, for more complete collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous communities. And in the meantime, they hold what they hold, the artifacts and the structures and the images and the burials and the accumulated sediment of human presence. They hold the evidence of 12,000 years of people living in this landscape, adapting to it, transforming it, being transformed by it, leaving their marks, leaving their stories in the only form that could survive across such a span of time. The forbidden caves are not locked away from us out of malice or out of arbitrary restriction. They are protected because they are precious, because they are fragile, because they are finite, because once they are damaged or destroyed, the information they hold is lost forever. They are protected because they belong to specific communities who have the right to determine what happens to the remains of their ancestors. They are protected because we have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that not everything that can be known needs to be known immediately, that some things are worth more intact than analyzed, that preservation for the future is as important as investigation in the present. If you have stayed with this exploration to the end, through 12,000 years of human presence, through the layers of evidence and interpretation and ethics and mystery, I thank you. Whether you came here to fall asleep or to think deeply about the relationship between past and present, about the marks that people leave on the landscape, about the silences that surround even the most thoroughly studied sites, I hope you have found something of value. Subscribe if you want more of these deep explorations into the long arc of human history, into the places where the past is still present, into the questions that do not have easy answers. Let me know in the comments what draws you to these ancient places, whether you have been to the Southwest, whether you have felt that connection to deep time that the landscape can create. And let me know where you are as you listen to this, what time it is, whether you are surrounded by stone and silence or by the noise of the modern world. The caves of the Southwest wait in the red rock country, in the alcoves and the overhangs and the sheltered spaces beneath the cliffs. They wait in the canyons where water still flows, and in the canyons where the springs have dried, and in the remote places where few people ever go. They wait behind gates and behind layers of bureaucracy and behind cultural protocols. They wait in the knowledge of archaeologists and land managers and tribal elders. They wait in the darkness and the silence, holding what they hold, preserving what they preserve, keeping their secrets, and slowly revealing them to those who approach with patience and respect and the right questions. The history they hold is not forbidden in the sense of being prohibited knowledge, not forbidden in the sense of being dangerous or corrupting. It is forbidden in the sense of being protected, of being held in trust, of being preserved against the pressures that would destroy it. It is forbidden because it is sacred, because it is precious, because it is irreplaceable, and it is waiting. Waiting for the time when we have developed the relationships and the methods and the ethics that will allow us to learn from it without destroying it, to honor it without appropriating it, to study it without violating it. Waiting for the time when the descendants of the peoples who created it can engage with it on their own terms, can reclaim it, can interpret it through their own cultural frameworks. Waiting for the time when the caves can speak and we can hear what they are saying, can understand the full depth and richness of the 12,000 years of human history they have witnessed. Until that time, the caves remain as they are, silent and protected, hidden and known, forbidden and preserved, witnesses to the long human presence in the Southwest, to the adaptations and the achievements and the transformations of peoples who made their lives in one of the most beautiful and most demanding landscapes on Earth. The stone endures. The evidence endures. The connection endures, fragile but real, between the people who were and the people who are and the people who will come after. And the caves, patient and silent, continue to hold what they have always held, the marks of human presence, the traces of human lives, the fragments of stories that are still, slowly, being recovered and told. The work continues. The exploration continues. The protection continues. And the mysteries, the deep mysteries of who we were and how we lived and what we believed and how we understood our place in the world, these mysteries persist, held in the stone, held in the silence, held in the forbidden caves of the Southwest, waiting. 12,000 years is a long time, long enough for ice ages to end and climates to shift and cultures to rise and flourish and transform, long enough for languages to evolve and change and sometimes disappear, long enough for knowledge to accumulate and be refined and sometimes be lost, long enough for the landscape itself to change, for rivers to cut deeper, for cliffs to erode, for caves to form and sometimes to collapse. But 12,000 years is also recent, is within the span of human memory, broadly construed. Is close enough that we can still see the marks, can still find the evidence, can still trace the threads of continuity that connect the first people who sheltered in these caves to the people who live in the Southwest today. The caves bridge that span of time. They are the physical places where the past and the present meet, where you can stand in the same spot where someone stood 10,000 years ago, can see the same stone, can touch the same walls. The human presence has been brief by geological standards, has barely marked the stone, but it has been there, continuous or intermittent, for 12,000 years. And the caves remember, or they hold the evidence that allows us to remember, or they hold the silence that reminds us how much has been forgotten. This is the story of the forbidden caves of the Southwest, not a simple story. Not a story with clear beginnings and endings and resolutions, but a story that is deep and complex and ongoing, a story that encompasses 12,000 years of human presence and the efforts of the last century to understand that presence, a story about preservation and discovery, about ethics and access, about the relationship between those who study the past and those whose ancestors created it. The caves are there. They have always been there. They will continue to be there long after we are gone. And what they hold, what they preserve, what they can teach us is worth protecting, worth respecting, worth approaching with humility and care, and the recognition that we are just one more wave of people passing through this landscape, trying to understand it, trying to leave it better than we found it, trying to honor those who came before and to preserve for those who will come after. The silence of the caves is not empty, it is full. Full of time and stone and the accumulated presence of 12,000 years of human lives, human struggles, human creativity, human adaptation to this beautiful and demanding land. And we, for our brief moment, can listen to that silence, can try to hear what it holds, can try to learn from it, can try to preserve it. The forbidden caves of the Southwest wait in the Red Rock country, protected and hidden, known and mysterious, preserved and slowly revealing themselves, witnesses to the deep human history of this landscape. and keepers of stories that we are still learning to read.